Good evening. My name is David Ellenson. I am the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis, and it really is a great, great pleasure to welcome you here. The event this evening is really part of a much larger series that the university has been hosting. As all of you know, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the appointment and confirmation of Louis Dembitz Brandeis to the United States Supreme Court, and Brandeis quite rightfully, named in honor of this great man and the ideals that he represents, which we hope to embody, has decided to employ this year as an opportunity to celebrate Justice Brandeis and his legacy. I am particularly happy to welcome here my colleague Daniel Terrace, who has been chairing this for the Brandeis University Centennial Celebration, and I'm really very, very grateful, Daniel, that this event was able to be part of this larger structure of celebration. Clearly, we've already had a couple of events. Many of you were here when Justice Ginsburg spoke about the legacy of Justice Brandeis, and that was certainly a remarkable event, and it provided us with an opportunity to reflect on who Justice Brandeis was as a Supreme Court justice and the way in which he really served as a progressive voice in so many ways for his time, and certainly the legacy that he put forth as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and in light of all of his many other activities, has been clearly an enduring one. We are happy to welcome any number of distinguished visitors here tonight, but I would be remiss if I did not note that Louisa Popkin, the great-granddaughter of Justice Brandeis, is here. And Louisa, stand up for 1 second. So you can check on what everyone has said tonight to see whether, in fact, the tales they tell about your great-grandfather measure up to family lore. When this celebration began to take place, we at the Schusterman Center, and I had an early talk with President Lynch and with Daniel, Dr. Terrace about this, felt that an important part of coming to appreciate the totality of Justice Brandeis's legacy was the role that he played, really not only in the creation of the Jewish state, but I'm going to say even more particularly in the creation of an American version of Zionism. The role that Justice Brandeis played in legitimating Zionism in the United States, particularly when one considers the German Jewish American class out of which he emerged, can really not be exaggerated. Justice Brandeis, of course, was in so many ways, albeit that he came initially, of course, from Louisville, Kentucky, was in many senses a Boston Brahmin, and he existed at a time, or he lived at a time, when in fact the German-American Jewish community was by and large quite hostile to Zionism. His decision to make himself informed about Zionism and the leadership role that he played, and that will be discussed tonight in the context of his progressive politics and the larger issues that confronted the American Jewish community at this time, were really seminal in the development of Zionism and the role that American Jews took in relationship to Zionism. After Justice Brandeis adopted his stance towards Zionism, it became quite difficult for those people who were opposed to the nascent movement of Jewish nationalism at the turn of the 20th century to claim that American Jews who supported Jewish nationalism, the rebirth of the Jewish people as a nation state in the land of Israel, were guilty of dual loyalty. Tonight, what we hope to be able to do is to talk about this crucial part of Justice Brandeis's legacy, and we'd like to place it again within the context of these early 20th century events, and hopefully also be able to discuss what the enduring elements of that legacy are, both in America, the diaspora, and in the state of Israel itself. And to do this, we really have an extremely, extremely distinguished panel. Immediately to my left is the interim president of Brandeis University, Lisa Lynch. As a newcomer myself to Brandeis this year, it is hard for me, indeed, I cannot exaggerate the wonderful role that President Lynch has played in leading the university through what has been, in many senses, a challenging period. She stepped up at a time when the university needed superb leadership, and I would say that part of what Lisa Lynch does so very, very well is that to the degree that leaders are required to be symbolic exemplars, people who embody the best virtues, talents, and beliefs of a given university and to what we would aspire to, there could be no one better than Lisa Lynch. Lisa is a graduate of Wellesley College. Some of you may have heard of that university. I think it's primarily defined as being close to Brandeis University. She did her master's and doctoral degrees at the London School of Economics. She worked in the Clinton administration in the Office of the Department of Labor. She has taught at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She was dean of the Heller School here at Brandeis, was the provost, and for the last year or more has served as interim president. I suspect she is waiting for July 1st, 2016 to come as she moves back into the provostship. Next to her is Fran Malino. Fran is a graduate of Skidmore College, who did her master's and doctoral degrees here at Brandeis University. She is a professor at Wellesley College of History, and in a point of personal privilege, I would also say that one of our daughters, when she attended Wellesley University, wrote her undergraduate senior thesis, her honors thesis, under Dr. Malino's direction. So we have always been appreciative for that. We have a long personal relationship that goes back many years. This should not be part of an official introduction, but her brother was one of my best friends at both Hebrew Union College and Columbia University, and we've known each other for many years. She is an expert in French Jewish history, European Jewish history. She's written a great deal, too, on Irish Jewish history. Her breadth is really quite significant. She wrote an article in the Festschrift that honored our former president, Yehudah Reinhardt, on Mayor Briscoe, who was the Jewish mayor of Dublin. And you're going to see that she will add tonight, I think, a very important perspective that will place Justice Brandeis within the context of the early 20th century. And a course that she teaches at Wellesley compares Irish and Jewish nationalism among Americans during the early part of the 20th century, and we'll be in for a treat with her speaking. In the center of the panel, it's good to see you in the center, is Professor Yehudah Mirsky. Dr. Mirsky is a graduate of Yeshiva College. He also attended and graduated from Yale Law School. He worked for many years in the Human Rights Division of the Department of State for the United States of America. Ultimately, he made Aliyah. He moved to Israel. And during his time there, he also decided to pursue academic studies, and he received his PhD at Harvard University, writing really a dissertation of unparalleled distinction on Rav Kook, one of the great leaders of Zionism in the early 20th century. I am extremely proud to indicate that just yesterday, he was nominated for the Sammy Rohr Book Prize. This is a prize given every 2 years by the National Jewish Book Council. It selects the 5 best nonfiction books written over a 2-year period. To simply be nominated is a mark of incredible achievement, and I think all of us at the Schusterman Center and in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department and at Brandeis University are really extremely proud to have a scholar of Yehudah's rank and breadth on our faculty, serving as our colleague and teaching us.
I think a round of applause.
Yes. Really a very wonderful award. Next to Yehudah is Jonathan Sarna. I would begin to list the different awards that have been given to Jonathan Sarna. But if we were to do that, we would not have an evening. Suffice it to say, Jonathan is a faculty brat here at Brandeis. He is a graduate of Brandeis College. He did his PhD at Yale University. He has written countless books, countless articles. He appears everywhere. The words indefatigable and brilliant do not even begin to exhaust his indefatigability and his brilliance, and he will have a word or two, I am sure, to say about Justice Brandeis in the context. Suffice it to say, too, that his work on American Jewish history is really the premier work, and Jonathan really is the leading historian in the world of the American Jewish experience. Next to him is the associate director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. Ilan Troen, my predecessor, did a wonderful, wonderful job here at Brandeis in really forging this center. But I have to say, Ilan, that if there was really one mark of your brilliance, it was selecting Rachel Fish to be the associate director. Given the staff that we have at the Schusterman Center, I would say that it moves forward and advances the center, I hope, under my leadership. But it does so because I have people like Rachel, Risa, Anina, and others with whom I work. Rachel is a native of Johnson City, Tennessee, as a boy from Newport News, Virginia. I thought I would mention that. She is a graduate of George Washington University, where she played soccer. Just thought I would throw in a few other details. She did her master's in theological studies at the Harvard Divinity School, completed her PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic studies, writing on ideas of binationalism in the 1920s in Palestine. She is a tremendous administrator, a person with extremely deep insights about the nature of the American experience in relationship to Israel as well as Israel itself during that period. And we really look forward, all of us tonight, eagerly to listening to all of you discuss Justice Brandeis and the legacy that he leaves us in relationship to Israel and Zionism. So I now turn it over to our moderator, President Lynch.
Thank you, David, for that terrific introduction. And may I just say that as part of our Mutual Admiration Society here, that it is so wonderful having you here at Brandeis and in your role as director for the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. We are all so grateful for your leadership, for your experience, and your just general wonderfulness, to use that. I'm trying to come up with the same words that you had for Jonathan here. Jonathan, let's begin the discussion with you. As David hinted in his introduction, Brandeis wasn't sort of the obvious candidate for the country to sort of think of as the leader for American Zionism. So walk us through a little bit about sort of the enduring mystery of this transformation of Brandeis to the leader of the American Zionist movement.
No, it's really a wonderful question, and let me say what a pleasure and privilege it is to be here. First 50 years of Louis Brandeis's life, he's no ties even to the Jewish community, doesn't belong to a synagogue. His brother-in-law with whom he's friendly is Felix Adler, who performed his marriage, had actually renounced Judaism for ethical culture. Brandeis didn't live in a Jewish neighborhood. He didn't contribute much to Jewish causes. If you read his private letters, he describes the Jews of Boston as crude and materialistic. So what kind of a midlife crisis is this that such a person suddenly becomes head of Zionism? 1914, he's really the so-called leader from the periphery who becomes the head of Zionism, de facto one of the great central figures in world Zionism, head of American Zionism, and becomes deeply engaged in Zionist causes and remained passionately involved, really, for the rest of his life. It also becomes a central focus of his personal philanthropy, about $1.6 million in the days when that was real money.
I'd take
he
it today.
gives, he gives to Zionist causes. So what accounts for this remarkable conversion? Conversions in general are somewhat inscrutable. So some look to his uncle, Louis Dembitz. Dembitz was an early Zionist. He has an article in the very first issue of the Zionist Maccabean. Dembitz is Orthodox. We know that Louis Brandeis was devoted to that uncle, but the truth is that Brandeis didn't become Orthodox, and the uncle had been dead for some years. How does that really account for the conversion? It accounts for his middle name, which he took after that uncle, Dembitz, but it doesn't account for the conversion. One of the distinguished PhDs here at Brandeis, Alon Gal, who later had a long career in Israel, argued that it was really encounters with anti-Semitism that transformed Brandeis, that brought him back to his people. As Melyarovsky points out, that's hard to justify from the papers of Brandeis. He's not always complaining about anti-Semitism this, anti-Semitism that. On the contrary, here's a man who's become nationally famous and took on the President of the United States, William Howard Taft. So that theory is difficult. Brandeis himself points to his involvement suddenly with East European Jews after a great strike, the great cloakmakers' strike in 1910. Brandeis is called in to help mediate. He and the other great Jewish lawyer, there are two great Jewish lawyers named Louis, both born in the same year, Louis Brandeis and Louis Marshall. They didn't like each other that much, but both remarkable. And both of them are involved. And Brandeis is very impressed with these East European Jews whom he's met for the first time, and he argued they helped to bring him back to his people because here are these strikers, and they're referring to the prophets, and they're talking about social justice ideals of Judaism, and Brandeis says, these were ideals I subscribed to. I didn't know that they were in these Jewish sources. But I also think that we need to look at the context of the time. This is the eve of World War I. This is a great humanitarian crisis, in many ways akin to what we are seeing on television now from the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees with the outbreak of World War I. Their villages have been destroyed. They have nowhere to go. Brandeis had a sense over and over. You have a crisis. You need a solution. And to his mind, Zionism offers a practical means of solving that problem. Clearly, all of those refugees could not come to the United States, which everybody saw was becoming more and more nativist, putting up more and more, dare I say, walls against immigrants. America can't accept them. Where will they go? Zionism is that solution. Brandeis is close to Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is talking about the American dream and how it should be spread outward. And in a way, that's what Zionism is. We're going to take that American dream and create a kind of American-inspired Zion. And that brings him really to the movement. When he's appointed, nobody assumed that he would be more than a figurehead. And astonishingly, he jumps in and barnstorms the country. And as David said, he redefines Zionism, meaning he doesn't use the European terms, which never would have succeeded in America. He doesn't attack diaspora countries. He argues that Zionism is the most American of movements. The Zionists are our Jewish pilgrim fathers, he says. Democracy and social justice and liberty. That's Brandeis's Zionism. And then he turns past wisdom on his head. To be a Zionist, says he, is to be a better American. To be good Americans, we must be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. Now, I don't know if that syllogism would pass muster with the philosophy department, but Jewish masses found it immensely powerful, and it negated the earlier claim that Zionism is dangerous and un-American, and he then takes that Zionism and argues that we will create in Zion a commonwealth, note that American term, which makes its way into the Balfour Declaration and to his conception of Zionism. There's going to be education for all, life, liberty, happiness, industrial liberty, equal opportunity. Indeed, to his mind, they are going to shape a country in which all is possible, which we had pictured to ourselves as desirable. This becomes Louis Brandeis's utopian dream.
Well, Yehudah, sort of picking up from there, so how do you think about Louis Brandeis and Zionism in the context of identity politics and the paradigm of return?
Yeah, about which more in a second. First off, just again, I'm delighted to be here. And thanks everyone, and thanks to David for that, faintly embarrassing introduction. And it's really a pleasure because also I have to say that Louis Brandeis was a hero of mine 30 years before I started teaching in the university named for him. So when I was in law school, I studied with Robert Cover, studied American legal history with Robert Cover, and there we drank deep from the well of Louis Brandeis. And so this, and also just one has to mention, one of the things that's always so captivating about Brandeis is the relationship between idealism and practicality, right? A man of high ideals who's always figuring out how to get them done. Now this piece of it, what's so interesting is we've spoken about this, that for me, he's another instance in what others in America, in modern Jewish history, see sort of this paradigm of return. There's a figure who's deeply engaged in the life of their times. Perhaps was, Jewish ethnically, but not much more than that, no religious ties. Involved in politics, society, and so on. And then something happens, some set of events or occurrences that sort of throw them back on themselves, lead them to discover in themselves a kind of allegiances, loyalties, connections that they didn't know they had or weren't conscious of before. They choose to act on it, return, but in some cases, like as for Louis Brandeis' case, there's nothing to return to, because it's not like, unlike so many of these East European Zionists who, left the world of their fathers, right, and then sort of eventually find some way back. But part of this very modern form of return is that he doesn't just put on a yarmulke, go to a synagogue, and become a religious Jew. It's not a simple return to a tradition. Sort of they re-engage with their Jewishness and then refashion it. So Theodor Herzl, right, the founding father of Zionism, is a premier example of that, of course, right? This Viennese playwright who, for a variety of reasons, but most profoundly, he was largely deracinated. Herzl, not entirely as deracinated as people think, it seems, but largely, the experience of anti-Semitism, the inability of the liberal nation state to contain anti-Semitism, indeed it's seeming to breed it, leads him to construct this new idea of Jewish politics. Another example of the paradigm of return, not in a Zionist context at all, is the theologian Franz Rosenzweig. Right, sort of this great example of somebody who's deeply engaged with the intellectual life of his times, finds himself thrown back on his Jewishness and reconfigures it. And indeed, some of Rosenzweig's disciples were among the founders of Brandeis University, and then Louis Brandeis himself. And this contact with the garment strike in 1910, also speaking of Inyane Dioma, the matters of the day, one of the people with whom he was in contact was Meyer London, who was the first socialist congressman. Turns out there was another one who was, it's amazing to me, remember these old Yiddish socialists that I grew up with, and turns out one of them was cryogenically preserved in the snows of Burlington. It's just, at any rate, so there's something about this encounter with these East European, as Yurovsky in his biography has this wonderful description of sort of everybody in the room in these labor negotiations, they're arguing with one another in Yiddish, and they're arguing about philosophy, and they're arguing about socialism, they're quoting the Bible at one another, and he didn't know Yiddish, but he knew German. And so that's one piece of it, and I think, Jonathan, it's marvelous also bringing out the humanitarian dimension here. But there's also another element, and crucial here is Brandeis' friendship with his student and then younger colleague Horace Callan, right? A student at Harvard, and then philosopher, deeply influenced by William James and James' notions of pluralism and metaphysics, and in Callan and in correspondence with Brandeis working out this position, they developed this idea that Americanness, the American idea, thought through to its deepest intentions, will yield a broader and richer harvest of what we call identity, of meaningful belonging that goes well beyond the social, ethnic parameters of the Protestant elite that had established America. And that the American idea itself is about pluralism, right? And Horace Callan is the one who develops the idea in the American context of cultural pluralism, while in part thinking about their Zionism. I mean, and it's not even, I think it's like so many of these things, it's not even a program that they're coming up with in a seminar room. But it's a matter of activist thinkers explaining themselves to themselves. Here I am, Louis Brandeis from Louisville. How is it that I'm so drawn to this? How is it that I find myself in this, and yet I do? But he does it in a distinctively American way. He fashions a distinctively American Zionism. The liberal elements in Zionism are already there with Theodor Herzl, right? In the World Zionist Organization, women get the right to vote a long time before they do in the United States of America. And yet, Brandeis articulates this deeply American Zionism, where, first and foremost, Zionism is about freedom, it's about democracy, it's about establishing a small democracy untainted by the curse of bigness that he sees taking over America at the turn of the century. These commonwealths, a laboratory of democracy. And yet, the irony, of course, is that it's a cult, so there's an element here of celebrating a multiplicity of cultures, but of a distinctive kind. The ironic point is that he doesn't connect to the cultural Zionism of the Zionist movement, right? He's kindled by these East Europeans, but he never quite shares their cultural pathos, their cultural drama, their sense that Zionism is itself a revolt against Jewish history. Because in some ways, he's beyond it, because he grew up after and so eventually what leads to his break with the Zionist movement after World War I, with Chaim Weizmann. I mean, there's all kinds of organizational issues. What's so interesting that in 1921, he formally leaves the Zionist movement. The specific point of contention, this is the last thing I'll for now, the specific point of contention is the creation of the Keren HaYesod, a kind of national fund that Weizmann wants to create. And there's two things about this fund that drive Brandeis crazy, and they speak very much to the man. One is that it was a fund in which, in good Zionist practice, down to the present, the accounting and the bookkeeping was by design, not going to be the most punctilious. which, of course, is a man whose slogan for Zionism was men, money, discipline. So that drove him out of his mind. But the second was the funding choices coming out of a cultural program of Zionism. What do I mean? For Louis Brandeis, why spending money on funding a literary periodical instead of buying an extra ton of mosquito netting made absolutely no sense. Whereas for these cultural Zionists, it's very much of a piece. And so he creates a new kind of Zionism. He creates a distinctively American Zionism, and much of American Zionism and support for Israel runs to this day on the tracks laid down by Louis Brandeis. And it's about celebration of culture, but ironically enough, not the cultural revolution that the Zionists themselves, the majority of the Zionists themselves, were talking about.
Thank you for that. We're going to return to this issue of sort of the clash of the heroes between Weizmann and Brandeis. But Fran, just as we're sort of widening out a little bit our sort of understanding of Brandeis, in your work on Jewish identity and Irish nationalism, you use this comparative lens to examine the construction of identity. So what parallels do you see between Irish Americans, speaking as someone who that's my identity, and Jewish Americans in the early part of the 20th century?
Thank you, Lisa. Well, can I shift the question a little bit
Sure.
in the beginning and talk briefly about the parallels that I see Brandeis making? So
Okay, even better.
between Irish Americans, Jewish American Zionism, and Irish nationalism. And before I do this, I wanted to share with you a short tale. A number of years ago, David referred to the fact that I taught a course on Irish nationalism and Zionism, Comparative Perspective. And a few years ago, I proposed this course to my history department, and the members of the department were reluctant to have me teach this course because one member of the department said mixed marriages don't work. And had I, at the time, remembered Brandeis's pamphlet titled The Jewish Problem and How to Solve It, I would have found precedent for teaching this course. And forgive me, Ben Halpern, who was my thesis advisor, a beloved professor here at Brandeis, because he had us read that pamphlet, and I should have remembered. And he would have provided me the precedent I needed. And as I was preparing some thoughts on what I was going to say this evening, I thought that perhaps he also provided me, although I wasn't consciously aware of it, the inspiration for this course. Because it's in this pamphlet, The Jewish Problem and How to Solve It, Brandeis himself establishes the parallels between Irish nationalism and Zionism. So that's what I'm going to talk about briefly, and we may not come back to the questions about Irish nationalism, so I'll probably maybe talk a minute or two longer just to set the stage. So what did Brandeis say about the Irish, and why bring in the Irish at all on an essay on the Jewish problem? Well, let me read to you just a couple of sentences, and then I will take you through what I see as the parallels he was drawing between these two movements, and drawing them at a very particular moment in time. He wouldn't have drawn these parallels earlier, and 3 years later, he wouldn't have drawn these parallels. So it was a very specific moment in time that he was drawing these parallels. So he writes in this pamphlet, Zionism seeks to establish in Palestine a legally secured home where Jews may live together and lead a Jewish life, Jonathan already quoted this, where they may expect ultimately to constitute a majority of the population, and this is the important part for the Irish connection, and may look forward to what we should call home rule. And then he goes on a few paragraphs later, and he says, every Irish American who contributed toward advancing home rule was a better man and a better American for the sacrifice he made. Every American Jew who aids in advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, will likewise be a better man and a better American for doing so. So Brandeis establishes this parallel. Why bring in the Irish at all? Well, one could argue that the Irish represented a very significant diasporic community in America, a community that supported a homeland. Brandeis mentions that the American Jews won't necessarily go to the homeland they'll be supporting. Irish immigrants who came to America, in contrast to most other immigrants, only 10% of the 4.5 million immigrants that came to America, say from the middle of the 19th century to the turn of the 20th, actually returned home. And also the Irish were the first immigrant group to make ethnic demands on foreign policy. So these may have been some of the reasons he brought them in, but I'd like to make another argument, which is that Brandeis very specifically applied the term home rule to the Jews' aspiration for a homeland. And not only did he apply the term home rule to what the Zionists were seeking, but I think that he saw in the impact of home rule on Irish Americans, the impact of the home rule movement on Irish Americans, he saw a parallel salutary impact on American Jews. So let me just tell you very briefly in a couple of sentences, what was this home rule movement? Home rule meant, at the time that Brandeis was writing the pamphlet, home rule meant an independent parliament for Ireland. Ireland had had a parliament, but when Ireland became a colony, and I'll use the terms very purposely, colony of England in 1800, the parliament was dissolved. So home rule meant a parliament for Ireland. And although the home rule movement had leaders up until the end of the 19th century, the leadership really became most prominent in the hands of Charles Stewart Parnell. And it was Parnell who rescued home rule and Irish constitutional nationalism from the ashes. And Parnell was such an important figure that Herzl in his diary wrote, "I would like to be the Charles Stewart Parnell of the Jewish people." So Parnell was a known figure to the Zionists. And indeed, Parnell came to America in 1879. He met with President Hayes. He addressed Congress. He spoke in more than 62 cities in the United States. And he came to raise funds for the Irish in America and also to get the support from the Irish for home rule, Irish Americans for home rule. Irish Americans were radical Republicans, and they thought they would get Parnell to do their bidding before they gave him any money. And when Parnell left, he had the money, and Irish Americans had abandoned their commitment to the Republic and were supporting Parnell and home rule. So home rule was a very popular movement at the end of the 19th century. Just 1 year before Brandeis wrote this pamphlet, in 1914, Brandeis wrote the pamphlet in 1915, the British passed home rule for Ireland. And that meant Ireland would cease to be a colony and it would have its own parliament. And it also meant that Ireland would have autonomy except for international affairs, which it wouldn't. But finally and importantly, it was passed but not implemented because of the First World War. And the British were afraid that the Protestants in the North who were against it would cause problems. So they passed it, but would implement it in a calmer time. There is no doubt that home rule provided the Irish in America with pride and with dignity, and as they wrote, with a sense that Americans would now respect them because they weren't coming from a colony, they had their own homeland. And I would argue that Brandeis saw Zionism providing precisely that same pride and dignity to American Jews, and that he also saw Zionism as an antidote to the demoralization that he observed among American Jews. And to end this point, Brandeis writes, "We have also an immediate and more pressing duty in the performance of which Zionism alone seems capable of affording effective aid." Forgive me, I've been nursing a cold for a month. "We must protect America and ourselves from demoralization, which has to some extent already set in among American Jews." I could go on with a number of other parallels. Let me just throw out that Michael Davitt, a supporter of Parnell and head of the Irish Land League, and well known to Americans, was sent by the Hearst papers in America to the Pale of Settlement right after the Kishinev pogroms. And he wrote a brilliant book titled Within the Pale, The True Story of Anti-Semitic Persecutions in Russia. And David himself, in this book, declares that he has become a Zionist. And David was working hand in hand with Parnell. So there were many connections that Brandeis was making. I will not go into any more now, but I can if you have any questions. So I'd like to conclude with a brief description of Brandeis that Robert Briscoe provides us. Robert Briscoe was as Lisa said, the Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin. He was an ardent Zionist, a supporter of Jabotinsky. In fact, it was Briscoe that taught Jabotinsky guerrilla warfare. Briscoe had come to the United States in 1939 because he was hoping to convince Roosevelt to convince the British to let 1 million Jewish refugees into Palestine. And so Briscoe met with Brandeis, and it's a very poignant description, but it also helps us understand why Brandeis, in seeing Home Rule, the Irish Home Rule movement, as a model for Zionism, it was only for a particular moment in time. So I'll read to you this very brief description and poignant description of Brandeis. Justice Brandeis was as delicate as Frankfurter had said, but his mind had lost none of its penetration. He questioned me acutely on the physical force movement of Irgun. Briscoe was a supporter, obviously, of Irgun and Jabotinsky, and the illegal shipping of human beings to Palestine. I told him of my fears for European Jewry, and of course Briscoe was quite right, and my hopes of influencing President Roosevelt to pressure England. When I had finished, Mr. Brandeis said, "I am sorry, but I cannot go along with you. I do not agree with your ideas, nor can I approve of the things you are doing." It was a great blow to me that I had made no impression on this wonderful old gentleman. He must have seen the distress and sorrow in my face, for he said very kindly, "Anyway, let's have a cup of tea." Mrs. Brandeis brought the tea, and we chatted for perhaps half an hour more. He told her some of the things I said, restating my arguments in a brilliant and accurate summation. When the time came for me to leave, he said, "I am against you because I am an old man and have seen too much of bloodshed and violence and fair hopes befouled by the fog of war. But if I were a young man like you, I would be with you, talking as you have talked, doing exactly what you are trying to do. Will you then wish me luck?" I asked. And he answered emotionally, "I wish you luck." So I asked myself, was Brandeis just humoring Briscoe in saying that he might have supported him were he younger? Perhaps. It's hard to know for sure. But one thing I think I do know for sure, that had Brandeis written his essay, The Jewish Problem, 3 years later, in 1918, he would have had second thoughts about referring to the Irish, and certainly would not have referred to the Home Rule movement. Because by 1918, the Irish nationalist movement had rejected constitutional means, had rejected the ballot box in place of the bullet and the grenade, and absolute independence for Ireland.
Thank you, Fran. So, Rachel, let's extend the conversation further, and you could share with us, your thoughts about Brandeis and his views or non-views of the Arabs then living in Palestine, and put the discussion that we've had thus far perhaps in the context of early Zionist thought.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, President Lynch, and thank you for including me in this panel. As we've heard, Brandeis had in some ways quite an idealistic view of Palestine. When he goes to Palestine, he doesn't talk much about seeing the Arabs, right? He doesn't discuss the Arab community in any meaningful way, or think about the relationship between the Zionists who are in this state, this pre-state territory, or discuss really any interactions between these two populations. In 1929, he gives a speech and it's related to the Palestine Economic Cooperation organization, and the discussion around how American Jews ought to be providing support to the Zionists in Palestine. And during this time, there are Arab-Jewish riots taking place in 1929. And Brandeis expresses specifically his concern over the violence, but at the same time, in the following sentence, he outwardly expresses his support specifically for the Zionist Chalutzim, the pioneers, strongly supporting the claims from the Balfour Declaration to create a Jewish state. He doesn't reference the second component of, or just, just a Jewish homeland. And Brandeis calls for a defense by the Zionists in order to create the Shomrim and advance the Shomrim, the police, the Jewish police. He, in some ways, romanticizes who these police are, in some ways, the defense that they are providing, and doesn't take into consideration the perhaps tenuous stress that is emerging on the ground and the future consequences or implications that these lack of positive interactions are having. He encourages Aliyah, not necessarily from the American Zionists, but from Jews living beyond America. But again, coming from places of progressive values, which he sees Zionism as the heart of expressing and emphasizing those values, not because of what I would term a sense of crisis Zionism, right, a sense of anti-Semitism necessarily. But in this laboratory of democracy that he's envisioning, the population of the Arabs does not really register in this equation. It's not a point of discussion for him. And I would put this in a context in terms of understanding political Zionists and cultural spiritual Zionists during the Zionist thought taking place in that period of the Yishuv in the 19-teens and 20 period. So as we heard of this beautiful statement by Professor Mirsky regarding the praxis and the idealism that Brandeis attempted to merge or show the nexus between. In this case, he's much more focused on the praxis of how Jews and the Zionists ought to be engaged in nation building, the potential nation building, and the reclamation of a Jewish sovereignty in this territory. Whereas the cultural, which falls in line with many of the political Zionists of the time. And this is in contrast to the cultural spiritual Zionists that Professor Mirsky mentioned, followers of Achad Ha'am and Martin Buber and people that we know in the American context as well, like Judah Magnus, who becomes the president of Hebrew University. But these individuals are very concerned about Zionism becoming a narrow, chauvinistic nationalist movement, which Brandeis does not discuss in those terms. They proclaim that Zionism ought to be universalistic in some ways. And for Brandeis, he doesn't, and for them, for the cultural spiritual Zionists, the biggest question, rather than the praxis question, is the question of the Arabs, right? As Yitzhak Epstein refers to it in 1908 as the hidden question. And this is the question that's prioritized from the cultural spiritual Zionist perspective in terms of how the Zionists ought to be engaging with and interacting with this population, because ultimately it will become the crux of how this nation state either survives or does not, or fails. And Brandeis does not touch that. He doesn't touch that conversation, and one has to imagine that he understood that this other population was in the midst of the Zionist population, and for someone who does focus on the universal, democratic, progressive values, the Arabs don't appear in that equation.
Maybe we could, I'm going to open up, there's some questions out for the panel as a whole to react to. And I want to return, Yehudah, to a conversation you began about Ben Halpern's phrase, the clash of the heroes between Chaim Weizmann and Louis Brandeis and their respective views and vision of Zionism. So what was the core of that debate for those in the room who are not quite familiar with it? And let's start speculating as opposed to sort of talking about what we know of the time. What do you think would have happened if Brandeis had won that debate?
Oh, Lord. How Brandeis had won? It's hard to imagine.
We get to take out our crystal balls.
But I do, actually, before I do that, I do want to sort of say a moment about a little bit. I think in some ways I agree with you, in some ways I don't. I think for Brandeis and for so many of these, Franz helpfully called attention to the shifts in external political events and how they affect people's political views. So when Brandeis is coming to Zionism, like anybody who's coming to Zionism before World War I, is assuming on the Ottoman Empire being around. And whatever Jews manage to achieve in Palestine will be under the aegis of or by scrambling with. And the meaning of nationalism changes, and the meaning of national claims change after World War I. From the get-go, perhaps, one might say in retrospect naively, but relative, and certainly relative to other Zionists, he's very forthright about talking about equal rights for everyone in any putative Jewish commonwealth. He, again, perhaps naively, but genuinely believe, also it has to do with people's sense of what Palestinian nationalism is, and does it exist in their eyes as opposed to the inhabitants of the land. Through the 1930s, he has a scholarship fund that he funds for Palestinian Arabs to study in universities, including American universities. A number of his followers are involved in the binational movement, Brit Shalom. So it's a somewhat more complicated picture. Now, had Brandeis managed to retain, again, his arguments about Chaim Weizmann, in part, just personally, they didn't quite get along. Very different.
Sort of this person coming from Europe to the States.
This person coming from Eastern Europe, with all the, in some ways, it's a sharper version of a line running in Zionism between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, right? By the way, just bracketing for a moment the whole question of Zionism's relationship to Middle Eastern and North African Jewry, which is a whole another subject. Also a complicated subject, like what is it? But for Herzl and many Western European Zionists, again, Zionism is, political Zionism is born in Western Europe, and Zionism let's backtrack, right? For Achad Am, in this classic 1897 essay on the Jewish state and the Jewish problem, what is the problem of the Jews? What is the Jewish problem that Zionism is coming to answer? This is twofold. It's political and it's cultural, right? And Herzl is very focused on the political. That's part of Achad Am's criticism of him. And Eastern European Jews, on the one hand, there's the cultural dimension, and at the same time, the imperatives, sort of the demographic heft, the moral, the ground is burning underneath their feet more than it is for Jews in Western Europe. And so there's different sets of, for Brandeis, the most important thing, again, I'm curious to hear what Professor Sarna says, is to build in Palestine an orderly, disciplined, highly planned kind of society, and picking the best. Brandeis becomes more of an advocate of mass immigration in the 1930s, but before that, he wants only the best people to be going there, to build these kinds of model communities, to build the laboratory of democracy. And he doesn't see Zionism as a mass movement in that kind of way, the way Chaim Weizmann does. Those are, and as I mentioned earlier, the flashpoint is the creation of this fund, which is going to violate his sense of how things properly ought to work, and also the funding priorities speaking to cultural issues that don't speak to him. I'm curious what.
Jonathan?
Certainly at the time, people think this is a battle between what they call Washington and Pinsk. And that does, in some ways, highlight cultural differences. But one should not, I think, underestimate, really, the approaches to money that distinguish these two men. Remember, Brandeis in the United States has just been through the Pinchot-Ballinger affair, where he's the central lawyer. And he's very concerned about fiscal probity. After all, he's just indicted the President of the United States in some ways for not being straight and narrow. And here he sees a plan for the Jewish agency, which to his mind violates a cardinal sin. It mixes investment money and philanthropic money together in one great big Jewish agency pot, with the money going who knows where. To Brandeis, this just suggested everything that he thought was wrong about fiscal management. Nothing is more important to Brandeis than the stewardship of money. We have letters that he sent to your grandmother in which he wants every nickel accounted for. That, to Brandeis, was how he wanted his children to manage money. That's how he managed money. That's how he thought government should manage money. It is a stewardship view of money that is responsible and that one could probably trace back in Central Europe to attitudes towards money that were born there. Weizmann, on the other hand, has an instrumental view of money. Money's value is what you do with it. It's not very important that you account for every nickel. What's important is that you do good things, like a Rebbe. A Hasidic Rebbe gets money from all sorts of places, and he does good things with it. But if you asked him exactly to account for where the money went, he'd be totally unable to do it. What's important is that he did good things with the money. And by the way, if such people, the one a steward of money and the other instrumental view of money, get married, they soon get divorced. They're totally incompatible approaches. And so it was, and it's very personal. When you read Brandeis's letters, he totally distrusts Weizmann. He has respect for what he's accomplished and so on, but he finds that he can't trust him, and he can't trust the way he approaches money. And he won't give him any money. And indeed, the organizations that Brandeis sets up, even to some extent to this day, are very much organized in the way he wants them to be organized. So there's still a Palestine Endowment Fund, PEF, and every nickel is accounted for. They give to a whole bunch of organizations, each one, it's careful how it's done. The management is very Spartan, small number of people accounting for each dollar. Even when you send them a check, you have to be very careful to tell them which of the many charities under PEF you want the money to go to, and that's how it's done. That's the Brandeis way. Zionism would have been very different had it been Zionist, but my suspicion is the East Europeans, who had a very different approach to money and organization, would have not been attracted to that view. This was a great cultural clash, and the tragedy was that it was so personal, and it had become, in some way, something that had to be decided by a majority, so there had to be a winner and a loser, instead of finding some way to embrace both of these figures.
Fran, do you want to say?
Well, I guess I should bring in Ireland. So what I was thinking of as I was listening to you, to all three of you, is that clash, that cultural clash, is not unique to Zionism. And it's very much part of Irish nationalism as well. And Parnell, for example, whom I wished I could have found a meeting between Parnell and Brandeis, because I'm sure they did, but I couldn't, and Jonathan helped me by looking at Brandeis's papers. But in any event, Parnell, whom I know that Brandeis respected, or he wouldn't have used home rule, the term home rule, or the home rule movement. Parnell had no interest in Irish cultural nationalism. In fact, he had no clue as to who won the Battle of the Boyne, which was celebrated and commemorated every year by the Protestants and the Catholics supporting different sides in Ireland. And he couldn't stand the maudlin nature of Irish singing. And Parnell he was a political nationalist. And he was supporting home rule for the independence of Ireland. And yes, the Parliament of Ireland would address Irish issues, but they were agrarian issues. They weren't British industrial issues. And the Young Irelanders, who were cultural nationalists, supported the Irish language. They supported going back to old folk tales, and they were seeking to even write exquisite poetry, enriching the understanding of what was uniquely Irish. So that division that we see in the clash of leadership and in the clash of sort of directions for Zionism is replicated earlier on in Ireland. And Herzl was right that he wanted to be the Parnell of the Jewish movement. He was. He absolutely was. They died at the same age. They left a shattered party. They were outsiders to the party they led, and they both used the term rabble that they were leading. So the divisions, Parnell and Herzl, there were differences between them, but the divisions, I think, are in some respects to nationalist movements universal.
Well, I want to go back to something, Rachel, that you raised in your comments. We were sort of talking about Brandeis and his, this is the people's attorney, one of the leaders of the progressive movement in the United States, and sort of open up for anyone who wants to jump in, sort of talking about how you square Brandeis's role as being a leader of the American Zionist movement, his commitment, his progressive commitment to social justice, and then more generally how Zionism was viewed within the progressive social movement at that time. So.
Well, look, I really defer to these two men here. This is not my area of expertise. What I would say only, and then I would ask that they jump in, is that within American Zionism, it's not a monolithic voice either, right? There are divergent perspectives as well, and the claims that are being made by Brandeis are not all agreed upon by other American leadership, particularly some religious leadership at the time. So that's a real tension, I think, that the American Jewish community relates to and feels with regard to what is the roles and responsibilities of the American Jews in terms of their behaviors towards or engagement with Zionism. And also, just to build on the binationalism component, it's very interesting because someone like Hans Kohn, who also has these Zionistic ideas, goes to Palestine, right, is part of Keren Kayemet LeYisrael, imagines, building this place. He eventually sees that it's not successful, comes to America, becomes a scholar of nationalism, but still wants to engage in being a Zionist, so he works with the American Jewish Committee to create scholarships for Hebrew University for Arabs living in the territory, right? So there is this sense of being, again, from the outside, and trying to engage in some sort of democratic, liberal, progressive values that we, especially in America, feel very close to.
So on the one hand, it's easy to find statements, and I agree with you, in which Brandeis speaks, and the Zionist movement, we declare for political and civil equality, irrespective of race, sex, or faith of all the inhabitants of the land. But if you read Brandeis's letters, and this is actually true of many of the American Zionists, it's perfectly clear that they view Zion through the prism of cowboys and Indians,
Right.
basically. The Zionists are the cowboys, and the Palestinians are the Indians. And you can trace that, and you know, the Indians make various skirmishes and act up once in a while, and the cowboys have to remind them of who's boss. Nevertheless, we respect the Indians, and there is a certain mystique. And of course, that leads in American Zionism all the way to one of the great cowboys and Indians films ever made with Paul Newman. It's called Exodus. Exodus is, of course, a cowboys and Indians movie in all of its dimensions. And if you go then and look at how it's advertised, it's very much advertised in that form. And I think it accurately portrayed the world as it was viewed for a long time. We don't view it that way today, but it's perfectly understandable to my mind why Brandeis did view it in those terms, even as he wanted nothing more than to raise up those Indians and turn them into equal inhabitants of the land. And it is, I think, a remarkable document. Some of the idealistic documents. What I read to you was from something called the Pittsburgh Program in 1918 of the Zionist movement, not to be confused with the Pittsburgh Platform of Reform Judaism, which is a different year and entirely different. But this is, basically the most social justice kind of document you could imagine. Not just equality, but equality of opportunity. They have a kind of Henry George view of the land. The government is going to own it, and a cooperative principle is going to be applied, and free public instruction, all grades and departments of education, and so on and so forth. This is the utopian ideal of Zionism that I think not only attracted Brandeis, but made Zionism so attractive to American liberals broadly, to the New Republic, to Hapgood, to many of Brandeis's friends who share his excitement about building this social commonwealth in Zion, where all of their ideas about how of social justice and of progressivism and of what Protestants called the social gospel would be enacted and lived out, including various ideas that hadn't made it in America, but that he hoped would make it in this new utopia that would be created in the Middle East. And Brandeis, well into the 30s, he believes that it is a kind of utopia. He writes in astonishment when he heard there were criminals in Palestine, and writes to Henrietta Zold, how can this be? And in the 1930s, with America mired in the Depression, he asserts that Palestine is really the only place in the world where everyone is truly happy. Now, that tells us more, I think, about Brandeis than about Palestine in the 1930s. This, to him, he once calls it, when he leaves after the fight with Weizmann and he loses, he talks about, like Cromwell, a kingdom of heaven is his goal. And kingdom of heaven is what he had in mind. Now, that's a fabulous way to attract people to a movement. Yeah, Bernie Sanders also, we have to bring him in again, wants to create a kind of kingdom of heaven. I think he didn't have to deal with the messy realities many of which occurred later, and others of which I think, and your story from Briscoe is so poignant, by the time he's getting old, he's not going to deal with those kinds of issues. The young Briscoe will have to deal with them. He's going to continue with that Zion that to his mind was so wonderful. He writes to his wife on his one visit to the place in 1919 that it reminds him, Ellenson is right, and it reminds him of California, but it's even better than California because it's small. I mean, this tells us again more about how Brandeis sees in Zion, which he's fallen in love with, everything that he thinks is right and true. And there's something very wonderful about that. And I don't think it just attracted Brandeis. I think it helps to explain why this movement that had maybe 15,000 supporters in all of the United States before Brandeis, in Brandeis's lifetime is going to have hundreds of thousands of supporters and is then going to win the commitment of the President of the United States.
Fran or Yehudah? You want to-
Well, I was just going to ask you, because American history is not my area of expertise, but certainly in that pamphlet, Brandeis says that there are no criminals in Palestine. He says that in the pamphlet.
I think they've now found one or two in recent years.
But what was interesting is he was saying it then in contrast to what he was watching and observing in America among American Jews. So I would argue that this utopian view of Brandeis is also how are we going to deal with American Jewry, and how did they deal with Irish Americans and the criminality and the alcohol and all of that, and how are we going to deal with the American Jews and the criminals and the breakdown of the community as a result of having come to a foreign place and all that. So Brandeis has as his goal that he's rectifying the American Jewish population with this view of Zionism. So to find criminals there throws the whole thing off.
Yehudah?
I do think it's worth noting, especially because, it's so striking. Nowadays, to tell people that for decades on end, Zionism was sort of part and parcel of American liberalism. That this was just one of that this was just part of the repertoire of American progressivism nowadays sounds a bit jarring. So it's interesting to sort of understand how that was. And Brandeis was responsible. It was understood, right? And Brandeis was played a key role to the formulation here. Remember, an ideal, at least as important for him as the smart management of money, was freedom. So one of the reasons he so respected money was because it gives you freedom. And so he saw this in what he framed Zionism, and it seems to have spoken to him that way, as this quintessentially American idea of a persecuted minority trying to find a society in which they could live as free men and women. And creating it in this, and sort of in that coming together with his progressive ideals, with the laboratory of democracy, with creating, like a well-regulated economy, these Henry George ideas that the government owns everything. So I think a number of these themes of, sort of political liberal themes that are kindled to political liberalism, then come together with some of his progressive ideals that he's projecting onto there. And I think, like many people, the 1930s press in upon him. I mean, it's always helpful to remember that Zionism was not a consensus position in the Jewish world as a whole until after the Holocaust, of course. And through he dies before the worst of it.
Right.
But through the 1930s, he's increasingly concerned. He's frantically trying to work whatever contacts he has with Roosevelt to press the British to open up the gates of immigration. Because he sees that things are not going in good directions. And I think that the press of those events, it's almost like questions about the Palestinian-Arab of Palestine are rising, and at the same time that the pressure to find some place for Jews to go, because remember, it's right after 1924, America is harder to get into, almost like puts those issues on hold, and people are just desperate to try, and Brandeis is very involved in those efforts as well.
Let me open it up to the audience. We have a microphone here. If people have some questions, I mean, what a panel. This is your chance to ask us. Joyce, do you want to, it's probably easier for everybody to hear, and we're also recording, so I know.
Thank you very much for a super panel. I'm Joyce Antler, American Studies program here at Brandeis. And I have a question about gender, and I wonder if it's relevant in any way to Brandeis's involvement in Zionism. First, that very important 1909-1910 garment workers strike, 80% of the strikers were, of course, women. I don't know if the people in the room who he spoke with included any women, but I did ask several Brandeis biographers, Mel Urosky, Philippa Strum, if it's possible that Brandeis might have been affected by the tremendous courage of these women who really were the strike leaders. So I wonder what you think about that. And then the second part is not the Eastern Europeans, but Henrietta Zold, who you mentioned. And I wonder what Brandeis thought of Zold, how influenced he was by her. I know that in a couple of her letters, there's a kind of sort of dismissive attitude, maybe not at Brandeis, but at kind of the male establishment that is not doing enough for Zionism, and she kind of says, oh, if Brandeis is the cat's meow, that's not the word she uses, but if he is so important, you know, why am I the one that's raising all this money? So, your thoughts?
I mean, a couple of things. First of all, it's just worth remembering that the two most famous Zionists are, in fact, Brandeis and Zold. It would be very easy, and I did it actually in the Reinhardt's Festschrift, to look at both of them in many comparisons, both born in America, unlike the massive Zionists, and both were folks that American Jews sought to emulate, a sense that you could be American and Jewish. You could be Zionist and thoroughly modern. Both are Spartan in many ways, the descriptions of Brandeis and Zold. So they're very similar.
Also, though, she's steeped in traditional Jewish
She
culture.
knows, right,
also.
absolutely. That's a huge difference.
Right.
There are other differences.
incredibly erudite.
She is kept, I mean, Brandeis contributes to the fund that allows Henrietta Zold to be independent, and he does so precisely because he believes so much in that goal of independence. Of course, Brandeis became independent through his remarkable powers as a lawyer, and he became independent young. And he makes that available to Zold. There is little doubt that he has great respect for what she has accomplished. After all, she has huge numbers of followers. She, like him, believed there were problems, and then you solve those problems. And you solve those problems through vast knowledge and information. Henrietta Zold reputedly could lecture doctors about medicine. She had learned so much on that subject before she gets involved in Hadassah nursing, and that was just Brandeis's approach as well. And in the letters, I think there is respect. Obviously, Brandeis is a Supreme Court justice. No Jew has ever attained that height before Brandeis, and this is the centennial, 1916. She is obviously in awe of that. But I think that he respects her, she respects him. Of course, she's there, and he's visited once for 10 days. So there is that difference, and one does have a sense, especially in some of the later letters, that she feels that he doesn't really understand what's going on, and that he set very high but unattainable ideals. At the same time, where people like her friend, I mean, the warmth of those letters at a young age between Henrietta Zoll and Joseph Hertz, the chief rabbi of England, but before then a rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Hertz turns on her late in life and mistreats her. She comes on Aliyat, he comes to inspect Aliyat HaNoar, and he tells her she's doing terrible things with these young people. And she's extremely offended. And he does it in a paternalistic, arrogant way, characteristic somewhat of the late Hertz. Nothing of that kind happens with Brandeis. And they do have a kind of public mutual admiration society. And if I'm not mistaken, he leaves a lot of money to Hadassah in his will, which again demonstrates how much he respected the organization. In terms of the cloakmaker strike, I think others may know more in terms of whom he really interacts with in 1910. But anybody who follows the Oregon decision and everything connected with Muller v. Oregon knows how much Brandeis does care about working women and their plight. How that exactly affects what Brandeis does, and what Brandeis is remembered for in that strike, is finding a middle ground between the union shop, which the unions wanted, meaning everybody should be the union, and the opposite, which of course is what the employers wanted, and he invents this kind of preferential union shop, giving the unions preference but allowing non-union, and that's his compromise. And then Louis Marshall likewise comes in and finishes the job. Louis Marshall really gives the name to the protocol of peace, and Marshall reputedly said, because they couldn't agree what to call it between labor and workers, the labor wouldn't agree that they were making an agreement with the workers. And the union insisted on that word. Marshall had the brilliant idea, call it protocol of peace. No one will know what it means. Everyone will be satisfied. It was a brilliant move. And the two Louis together managed to shape this agreement.
So if I could just say another word about Hadassah. Of the various, President Hadassah is an amazing story, right? I don't need to tell you, Joyce, like that how in American Jewish culture it's such a trope to make fun of like blue-haired Hadassah ladies. And this is an organization that just did amazing things, just did amazing things. And it was very Brandeisian in terms of Brandeis' version of Zionism. Also, within the Zionist movement, this was one organization that was very tight with him, was loyal to him. It was in that strict accounting, very focused on a specific set of problems. And Hadassah Hospital was avowedly non-sectarian. Right. And he said they made a point in Hadassah Hospital of having signs saying that this hospital is for Jews and Christians and Muslims and everyone. And this also speaks to something you mentioned. What exactly, are there any elements of Israel today where Brandeis leaves on? So I've sometimes thought, at least in its early years, in creating this model of the Zionist-oriented, non-sectarian hospital, that's one. To shift a little bit in jurisprudence, right? Shimon Agranat, this is American-born jurist, migrates becomes a justice in the Israeli Supreme Court. He's a young man. I think he maybe overlaps with Brandeis chronologically, but he never meets him. But he's an avowed latter-day disciple of Brandeis, sits on the Israeli Supreme Court, and incorporates American free speech doctrine into early Israeli, what we would call constitutional law in the 1950s. And he's doing it very deliberately as a disciple of Louis
Brandeis's
Brandeis.
impact.
So that's,
Yeah.
you know.
I'm looking at the time. Fran, do you want to get a, so Rachel, I'm going to give you the hardest thing to do. How would you summarize this discussion?
So on one foot,
Yes.
I think it is very, learning from other communities, such as in the case of the Irish. I think B, as we've heard both from Professor Sarna and Professor Mirsky, it's about how one interacts with practical, praxis, life, practitioner, institution building opportunities, but while retaining some of that idealism and that spirit. And I think the third that I would hope that our students take, especially from this and the millennial generation as well, is a reminder that to be Zionist is not in contradiction to one's Americanism, right? To be for one's own population and for one's own community only increases one's ability to engage in the American tapestry, and that individuals and young people should not shy away from thinking about what it means to do for the other in the universal sense, but also to do for one's own population and community as well.
I can't think of a better way of finishing the evening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.